Moon Knight is the most recent MCU related show that has recently finished airing on Disney+. And after a year of basically mixed bag stuff from Marvel, especially where their shows are concerned, Moon Knight feels a bit like a breath of fresh air. Because, to be honest, I think Moon Knight is probably the best show the MCU has produced to date. Now, before I get into why exactly I love Moon Knight, I want to just briefly talk about the previous Marvel shows that they released last year and just my very brief thoughts on them, because I don't want it to immediately sound like I'm discrediting every show they did last year, because some of them were legitimately good and a lot of them had some interesting ideas. So in regards to the shows that they released last year, I personally think WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier are on the same level playing field. They both started off with really interesting ideas and unique themes that we hadn't really seen before in the MCU, but by the time the shows ended, they just kind of fizzled out into nothing. And then we had Loki, which up to this point was my favourite show the MCU had produced. It felt like it was doing its own thing. It just kind of carried on doing that for the entire series, and it wasn't really bothered about having to check a load of boxes that most other MCU projects would do. It just felt like it was doing its own thing and was enjoying the ride whilst it was doing it. My only issue with Loki is that I do feel the very last episode grinds everything to a halt, because it is literally just one conversation dragged throughout an entire episode. Then you had What If, which was decent. It was a nice little diversion for what it was. And Hawkeye was also decent. And that actually did the opposite of what WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier did. It actually kind of got better as the show went on. Started off a bit rocky, but by the time you got to the finale, I was truly invested with everything that was going on, and I wanted to see more of it, which is what a good show should do. And then we have Moon Knight, which going into it, I didn't really know what to expect, because I knew of the character's existence in the comics. I'd heard of him before, but apart from that, I had no clue who Moon Knight was, what his powers were, just what his general deal was. I had no idea about any of that. Now, I'll get into more detail about the various things that I did and didn't like about the show in a minute, but I just want to start off by talking about the one thing that I absolutely loved about this show. Moon Knight feels different when you put it in the wider context of the MCU, specifically in terms of how it is made from a filmmaking standpoint. Now, don't get me wrong, I really like the MCU, but it has got to a point, especially in recent years, where a lot of the films that they produce within the Marvel Cinematic Universe start to feel more like products than legitimate films that have been made by people, and it just feels like it's being churned out for the sake of being churned out. Moon Knight, on the other hand, feels like the first Marvel project in quite some time where actual people have been at the helm and have been in control of it. It feels like it was made by actual people rather than it just feeling like another product. It feels like everyone working on it had a specific story to tell, and they wanted to tell it as best as they could. For example, I knew that with the very first episode I was in for something special, because everything from the camera work to the direction just felt a bit different. It didn't feel like your typical MCU kind of thing. There was a lot of handheld camera work. You could tell that these were actual people doing things rather than it just feeling like a green screen mesh of stuff. And there was genuinely a sense of frenetic energy throughout, especially that first episode, that I was like, this is kind of what has been missing in some MCU stuff recently. By the way, just a side note, I love this show so much that I ended up buying one of the graphic novels of Moon Knight, just because the show got me so hooked into these characters that I just want to know and read more about them. So I'm looking forward to delving headfirst into this at some point. Now, I think what really adds to that raw and somewhat grounded approach to filmmaking that you get with Moon Knight purely comes from the fact that it is directed by Mohammed Diab, Justin Benson, and Aaron Moorhead. Now, I specifically want to make note of the last two names there, Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead, who over the last couple years have developed a bit of a following in the indie filmmaking scene with films like The Endless and Synchronic. It's one of those things where once you realise who is directing the show and what their background is in terms of stuff they've made before, you start to see their fingerprints all over the show. There are moments in the show where the camera almost feels like it is really down and dirty in the middle of some of the fight scenes that are happening. Sometimes some shots last a little bit longer than you would expect them to, especially for something like this. I've loved Ethan Hawke in pretty much everything I've seen him in, and he is again really good here. He does a really good job of delivering a villain that you can kind of understand where he's coming from, and you can to an extent relate to him, but again, he does a good job, and this is not just down to his performance but how he's written as well, but it does a good job of genuinely showing you how far he has taken one specific perspective in his head. And I feel like not just the MCU, but most of the best villains that have ever been made, especially in terms of film, have that good balance of you can kind of understand where they're coming from. It's just that specific person has taken those opinions or those morals and has kind of taken them a bit too far. And then you have Oscar Isaac, who gives probably one of the best performances I've ever seen from him. Again, he's another actor that I pretty much have loved in everything I've seen him in, whether it's Star Wars, Ex Machina. I think the guy is a brilliant actor, but here he really does make these characters his own, and adds a lot of weight and depth and history into the characters he is playing just through his performance alone. Whether he's playing Stephen Grant or Mark Spector, he somehow makes both personalities feel very distinct and unique, whilst also strangely feeling like the same person as well. It's a very tough thing to do, especially if an actor is trying to portray someone who has DID, which is what the main character in Moon Knight has, and it is very similar to what James McAvoy did in Split. I also feel like the way the show is structured as well also adds a great deal to the main intrigue and mystery of the show, as well as keeping you invested as an audience member, because for the first 4 episodes you are following what is, for the most part, a fairly straightforward, action adventure sort of story, with that added sort of mystery element of Stephen's DID in the background as well. However, when you get to episode 5, which personally is my favourite episode in the whole series, you start to delve more into what makes Mark and Stephen tick. And the way it unravelled throughout that episode I thought was just so well done, and adds another layer that you weren't initially expecting with our main character. And genuinely, when you find out why certain things are the way they are, and why people are the way they are, it genuinely was quite heartbreaking and really was effective in a dramatic and emotional sense, because you've been following these characters up until this point and you're invested in what they're doing because of the last 4 episodes. So by having the 5th episode be a proper delve into these characters' psyches and properly getting to the core of why they are and who they are, I think that was a really clever choice. I feel like if you shoved it right at the start, it would be too much to take on board. If you shoved it right at the end, you'd kind of have the same problem as Loki, where you just kind of get a massive exposition dump right on the last episode. But by having it just before the end, on the 5th episode, I think really works, because it adds a lot of weight to everything we've previously seen, but also for that finale that allows it to kind of do whatever it wants to do. And by having the finale be just this massive, fight battle episode, again, didn't bother me as much as it did with WandaVision or Falcon and the Winter Soldier. By the time you get to that final episode, it does feel like it's kind of earned it. WandaVision didn't feel like that. Moon Knight, on the other hand, I feel like actually earns it by having that very dramatic and impactful episode right before it. It adds a lot of weight to that episode, and it just makes it a bit more palatable when it just delves more into the MCU stuff you were expecting. Now, as much as I love Moon Knight, and I do think it is the best show the MCU has produced thus far, that's not to say it's perfect. There are a few things that's stopping it from being like one of the best MCU projects, full stop. For example, some of the humour in the first couple of episodes really doesn't work and just kind of falls flat. And there's a few pacing issues in some of the episodes. That being said, I can easily see myself revisiting Moon Knight countless times in the future. Everything from the direction to the performances to the score just works so well in creating a cohesive and tight experience that genuinely feels like a bit of a breath of fresh air within the MCU. If you've seen Moon Knight, let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. I can't wait to have a discussion down there, and I will see you all in the next one.